we move now into a question session for our first few presenters. So that includes Jim and Jacob and Kelsey Young and Kelsey Preisel and Jim again. I'm going to go back here to the start of our chat where there's a couple of questions. Jake, if you're still on, just to give you a heads up, I'm about to ask you a question. We are going to have some discussion later about this of what types of maps maybe are the most useful. So the question here is, as geologists, we think of mapping rock composition, morphology, structures. Are there some other map forms that would be most useful or more useful to make informed decisions with respect to Artemis architecture planning? Go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, that's a great question, first of all. And I would encourage any of the other speakers to chime in here. And I know that'll probably be a common theme throughout the next 2 days. So I'll certainly give you my perspective. If you say geologic map, that maybe has some connotations to it. Sorry, Jim, if I'm making you cringe here, but if you're defining a geologic map specifically, I think there are other aspects. I've seen some of the conversation here about, other contributions to a geologic map that you may use to interpret. But from my perspective, thinking about exploration systems decisions, I can easily see situations where the questions we're asking maybe are a little bit different. And so the map, Jim was kind of saying this earlier, the map is a tool, right? I got my degree from Ron Greeley, and he said that to me almost every day when I was trying to get my dissertation. A map is a tool. It's not the final answer. So the questions you ask will drive what you need to do. We're going to be in situations where I think some of our stakeholders will be interested in understanding resources. I think there's situations here where those resources could, result in different types of maps. And when I say resources, I think everybody's mind jumps to ice quickly, and probably rightfully so. But there's other things like regolith density, regolith availability. Some of the resource potential is pulling oxygen out of regolith. Maybe that some regolith is better for that process than other. It may be more fractured or maybe smaller particle size. You maybe are looking at light, right? Where is the light? And we can make a map. We can use a model, create a map that says this is where it should be light at this time, but there's reality, and we're going to go and we're going to discover reality. So as Jim said, this is a very iterative process. And I tried to say in the beginning, this isn't a call to stations for a year or two to make a few maps and then, on to your next job. Like, this is the path we're on. And so we're going to constantly have to be creative and flexible and thinking about what are the big questions that we're asking moving forward. Because again, I can also start to envision things like maps that say, well, here's the density of samples we've collected per whatever, and here you may get to a point where we actually have enough data to say, here's the quality of the sample density in a certain area. If we're trying for chronology, we're having success in digging up small clasts that are helping us get good dates that we're confident in this region versus that region. Those are things you maybe can't tell from looking at a map that we would make today. We'll throw stipple marks and hash marks all over the place, but our questions will evolve rapidly once we start having an understanding of what we're looking at, and our maps will need to adapt accordingly, I think. So I don't know, Jim, if I just made your life harder, but that's my take on it. Maybe it's not a true geologic map, geologic map, but it's mapping that is really important here.
No, I think you got it spot on. And so there's not a whole lot that needs to be added there. I would emphasize exactly what Jake emphasized, which is, the way we have perceived geologic maps for planetary science is a little bit different than the way geologic maps are perceived for terrestrial geology and terrestrial science. And our colleague, like I said before, Dave Soller, will talk a little bit about this. And Dave's in charge of the National Geologic Mapping Database. And so terrestrial mappers, see there would be geologic maps and then derivative products. And it's really that derivative products that we're talking about. So yes, geologic units, but then also, yes, geologic units that have to do with the thickness of regolith and the distribution of boulders and the size of those boulders. And, the size of the boulders, that gets into resources because they're aggregates and can be pushed around to make berms in between a HAB unit and a landing site, those kinds of things. So it's not just geologic units for presenting fundamental science, it's evolved geologic maps. And so there might be a little bit of a lexicon issue here and how we're using these words. That's okay. That's something that we're trying to work out here, but we're talking about geologic mapping and any evolved or derivative product that's going to be able to capture and convey information that users might need. What task and mission planners are going to need is going to be different than civil engineering and resources. It's going to be different than the crew. It's going to be different than, scientists that's going to put samples into place later on and write a bunch of papers about it. So all of those things are kind of pulling different information and amalgamating it in a different way, but it's all the same kind of information. It's geologic information. That's what we want to capture.
Yeah, Jim, if I can add one more thing onto that too, it's by definition, where we're going, there are no roads here, right? We don't know. We're heading into new terrain and new territory and new philosophy on what we need to do. We certainly have learned a lot, and that talk that Dean put together is a great example. We can learn as much as we can from what we've done in the past, but at some point we're treading on new ground. And so that flexibility will be extremely important. And I think Jim had in his first talk, the slide that said, stakeholders. Maybe they're not extremely well defined. And that's actually one thing we're struggling with right now is with the Moon to Mars objectives, getting a handle on what the stakeholders want to do. I think the stakeholder community for the group that's online right now has probably been fairly constant over the last several decades. And what we're going to be asking in the future is for you to start thinking about how your skill sets merge with an extremely diverse set of stakeholders that are not probably in the realm of what you maybe consider today. And so I think that's where that flexibility, the adaptability is going to be very important. And I kind of urge you to think that way in the future.
Good comments, and there's a lot of discussion happening in the chat. I'm going to skip through these. It looks like most questions in the chat at this point have been answered. There's a question about pressurized rovers that's been answered. To keep us on this topic of maps, and also to bring a question with regard to sampling. So Kelsey Preisel, can I prompt you with a question to tell us a little bit about what you envision with sample maps? If we could fast forward 6 years from now and we have those sample maps, what kinds of information do you think are going to be the most critical to build on what Jake and Jim are already saying?
I think really just two things. One thing is just kind of providing that ground truth for what we are observing remotely. And so once we have the samples in hand, we know a lot more about those unit descriptions than we did before we got there. But then also for me, or at least the first thing that comes to my mind for why this is so exciting is the geochronology aspect and being able to put ages on these different units and their relations to each other. The recent PRISM 3 selection is going to be the first time we try to date something in situ with a method that is not crude sample return, or sample return in general. And so that's really the fringe of where we're at in the community. I think that's something that's really exciting about going to these regions and how that would then inform those maps by providing those absolute dates.
Great. Thank you, Kelsey. As Jim has said in the chat, we will collect data in our first discussion about stakeholders, and then we also have I believe it's our second discussion today about different map products. So all of this we're wanting to capture with you in Google Jamboards. Jim, can you talk a little bit more about, what it is that you're hoping, or we're all hoping to get? I know you talked about it in your presentation, but it seems like a lot of these questions in the chat are getting back at, this is the purpose of this workshop. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can. So I'm happy to do that. What I want to get, and what we want NASA to get out of this is an understanding of what stakeholders are, who the users are, who the contributors to these products are, because civil engineering, resources, geologic mapping for science, terrestrial mapping, all these people are not collaborating right now, and there's a lot that can be learned across this. So I want to understand who the stakeholders are. I want us to understand what the content is, and then what the scales are that are appropriate for what needs to be done. Because roving across the surface for Artemis 3, not that this meeting's focused on Artemis 3, but roving across the surface in Artemis 3 is a different kind of map than something for looking at resources and aggregates and that sort of thing. So, we need to understand stakeholders, content, scale, and then all the collaborative things that need to happen to make these products useful to the broadest part of the community as possible.
Thanks, Jim. And Jake, yeah, I just read back to that. For our final question for this question session, can you address the question about, we've got the candidate landing sites. When will those be down selected?
Yeah, Jim, thanks for asking. And I definitely don't want to be that headquarters person who comes in and like ducks out, real quick before like, oh, Jim took all the time answering his question. I can't answer that hard one. Yeah, and I'm really great at giving not great answers, Jim, and this is going to be a frustrating answer to you, but just to characterize what we did, those 13 regions are based off our assessment from the government reference model, what we thought were the good spots to go to. We're working with the contractors now, right? And we've talked in many forums at this point about this new paradigm we're working in, trying to nurture the companies to come along and really develop that ecosystem, that lunar ecosystem. So that's where we are right now. So we're working with now 2 contractors, understand what their capabilities actually are, which aren't exactly the same. And so we're trying. We're going to get that to you as soon as we can. I can't give you a date. But what we don't want to do is rush an answer to you that's not the right answer. So right now we're holding that 13. We got a lot of people working hard on that. I know that's not satisfying, but trust me, we're working it, and we're going to get an answer back out to you guys as soon as we can. It may be this fall, it may be this winter, but that's kind of the best I can say for you right now, Jim.
Great. Thank you for these comments. Some of the other questions in the chat, just so you know, we're going to get into more talks after our short break, and we will actually be talking more about pre-mission planning, factors that go into pre-mission planning, and what happens during the mission and after the mission. So we're at time right now. We're going to take a short break until 15 past the hour. So we went just a little bit over. We'll be back then to pick up with our next session on map scales and map products. Thank you so much to our first speakers.